Okay, when we talk about written language, one of the things that we want to talk about as well is eye tracking experiments because a lot of what we know about how people process written language comes from these kinds of experiments. So, what is eye tracking? Well, eye tracking is a really nifty way to see what exactly people are looking at in real time. So, what you do is you put this device on a person's head. It's kind of funny looking. Um, and when they have this device on their head, the device will be connected to a computer, and you can actually see what the person is looking at while they are doing a particular task. So um, this can be really helpful for, like I said, kind of seeing what people are looking at while they are reading. And it's also used for things like web design because you can see what people look at most quickly on a computer screen. Like one of the things that they've noticed that people definitely always look at when they get to a page that they haven't been to before is the left column and the top of the screen. And so, because people realized that, they started to design web pages so that the most prominent information can be found in those two places. And since things are designed like that, that tends to be where people look more often. So these two concepts feed each other. It's like that, so people do it, and since people do it, they make it more like that. So it becomes even more and more like that. So maybe from now on, when you think of when you visit a website, you'll think of this awesome class and all the great stuff you're learning in cognition. But anyway, that was a little bit of a deviation. So eye tracking devices look kind of like this in this picture right here. And I also thought it would be helpful if you could see a little demonstration.
Things we saw at the NEOPA meeting was video taken using the head-mounted eye tracking system. The person wearing it, you can see where they're looking by those little red circles that are jumping around. And the colored rectangles represent specific targets that have been pre-programmed into the system. That's what they're most interested in keeping an eye on.
So that's kind of what a video would look like on the screen, and you can have the computer, like in that case, the computer was programmed to show what they thought that the people would look at. But you can see that how you could definitely use information like that for a benefit. And if you're still curious about it, if you want to get more information, you can definitely Google videos for eye tracking, and you'll come up with all kinds of neat videos that'll teach you more about it. It's pretty cool stuff. Um, but for our purposes, we're just going to talk about how eye tracking is used to tell us a little bit about gaze duration. And what gaze duration is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's how long that the gaze lasts on a specific word while someone's reading something. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but we did talk about fixations when we talked about visual perception. And so, what a fixation is the place where your eye stops and focuses. So, in that video that I just showed, there was every now and then the person's eyes would fixate somewhere and they would look at like one of the liquor bottles or a different one, and that's fixation. So, here's kind of one representation of the data that's been gathered from things taken with eye tracking devices. And you can see the contrast between a good or a poor reader. And these arrows for the poor reader, you see often they go back and look back at things that they've already read. The numbers in here is the number of milliseconds that they would have fixated on that particular space. So this would correspond to this part of the sentence, 400 milliseconds here, and right here it's 367, just slightly shorter. And then it skips all the way with the good reader. They only fixate 4 times on this top row. And if you would add up these numbers, what is that? Less than 1,200, or a little less than 1,300 seconds. And then over here, I mean, this is definitely way more than 1,300 milliseconds. Sorry, I misspoke. So you can see this one, they go back more often. A good reader does actually go back and fixate on something they've previously fixated on before. just not as often as a poor reader. So this is one way that you could represent the kind of information that you could get from a good or a poor reader, or just from an eye tracking kind of experiments. Okay, so gaze duration procedures when it comes to studies with reading comprehension are based on a couple of assumptions that are somewhat limited and not necessarily entirely true. But that's not to say that we don't get anything from gaze duration procedures, because it's definitely helped us to understand how people read. But it's also important to know that it's not end all be all to online experiments. Like we need to have other types of information gathering to supplement the gaze duration studies, because these immediacy and eye-mind assumptions are not entirely true. The immediacy assumption says that readers interpret each content word as the text is encountered, and the other assumption is the eye-mind assumption, which says that you're going to keep fixating on a word as long as you're processing it. And neither of these is entirely true. It is true basically that we're going to interpret a word as we come across it, but we start to expect words before we see them while we're reading. And we also might continue to process a word when we start to read the next word later on. So we're not going to stop at the word until it's completely processed. We might actually move on in the sentence to have the word that we're currently on make more sense. So where your eyes look is not always what exactly that you're thinking of. And those are two of the assumptions that this eye tracking during reading are based on. Like I said, they're not completely true. And like this finding that we have regressive eye movements. Remember, the poor reader had all of those arrows going backwards. It happens with good readers too, but poor readers do it just a whole lot. Just was someone who studied these kinds of regressive eye movements. When sentence reference couldn't be determined right away, you might need to read on to understand what something means. And so you can see how that has to do with a couple of assumptions that eye tracking is based on. Here's another example from Just and Carpenter. Remember how Just was interested in when there's situations where people might need to continue reading to understand something that was previously presented. So here, this just is the order of the fixations, this top number for each line, or for each sentence. It's for each sentence. Okay, so here's one sentence, and then we start at number 1 again for this sentence. This next number is the length of the duration, as in the temporal length, how long that duration lasts. They stayed here for a really long time on flywheels because that's such a strange word. But then they move on to continue processing it. And that is the first mention of this word. It takes a very long time to process flywheels right here. Later on, this word appears again in the next sentence, and it's right here. And you can see there's a big drop in the amount of time it takes to process the word the second time it appears. So after it's appeared the first time, it's much easier to process, and that's one of the concepts that you need to be familiar with as we talk about all of these things. Okay, so all of this has had to do with online reading, and one of the strengths of studying online reading has to do with the duration of the word level processes, and as well as looking at the gaze durations. Even though it's based on some assumptions that aren't entirely true, it's still helpful, and it does give us kind of an idea of what's going on in a person's head while we comprehend and understand language. And in some ways, understanding written language can also help us to understand verbal language, which we'll get to later. Okay, hope this was helpful. Thanks.